Good morning, all. Thank you for joining this May 2023 VMware TAM customer webinar. The VMware Customer Success Organization hosts this webinar to allow you to interact directly with great speakers on topics that will help you maximize your VMware investment. Before we get into today's content, there are just a couple of basic announcements. First of all, as you see on the screen right now, our next TAM customer webinar will be on June 15th. The topic will be discussing and demoing how the NSX Advanced Load Balancer, you may know that as the AVI Load Balancer, is the glue to make your company's applications work. We want you to benefit from these sessions by interacting with the speakers. So if you have any questions during today's webinar, please use the Q&A feature of Zoom, and we'll address them during the webinar. If your question does not get fully addressed, follow up with your TAM, and they'll pursue an answer for you. At the end of today's session, you will be prompted to fill out a simple 2-question survey related to the value you receive from this session and any topic suggestions for future sessions. We value your completion of this survey to keep us pointed in the right direction going forward. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded, and your TAM can make the recording link available to you. After a few months, the recording will be publicly available on the VMware TAM Services YouTube channel. So that brings us to today's speaker and topic. Joshua Solomin has been a great friend of the TAM organization for the past several years, and we're glad to have him on today's webinar. He's a senior product line manager, and with vSphere 8 Update 1, we're seeing some of the fruits of his labor. I'll turn this over to Joshua and let him talk more about that with you now.
Well, thank you very much, Andy and Chris and the rest of the TAM org. And thank you to everyone who's attended to listen to this webinar. Quick introduction about myself. As Andy mentioned, I am a senior product line manager with VMware. I've been with VMware for about 5.5 years. I work for the Cloud Foundation and vSphere teams. Among other responsibilities, I am the product management lead for VCF security. And part of that responsibility, fitting well within the security bucket, is our identity strategy. And that's what I'm here to talk to you guys about today. So that is the topic of today's webinar, how VMware is going to help you modernize your SDDC login experience. Because as I'm sure many of you are aware, today and prior to the release of vSphere 8 Update 1, there was definitely room for improvement. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. First, a disclaimer. Standard product manager's disclaimer that anything I say here about products, versions, features, versions in features, when things will be released, all of that is subject to change, and none of it should be considered to be written in stone. Please don't make any purchase decisions based on anything I say here. All right, got that out of the way. So let's get right to the good stuff. Excuse me. I'm going to be talking to you here about our strategy to get to unified identity across our SDDC stack. Okay, what does that mean? Let's start by defining the problem. As we see it, we have a problem today across our SDDC components, which is a lack of a common identity experience. And really what that boils down to when you get down to the product level is we have 2 different and incompatible authentication systems across our SDDC stack, right? You have your vSphere with its legacy PSC-based authentication, and Cloud Foundation and SDDC Manager piggyback work with vSphere and that auth. But then on the other side of this gap, you have vRealize, soon to be ARIA products, and NSX, which work with VIDM, or what was called VIDM. It's now been rebranded to Workspace ONE Access, same thing. But the key point here is the Workspace ONE Access supporting products can't talk to the PSC supporting products, and thus there's no way to provide a single identity experience across all of them. This is, quite understandably, a lousy customer experience. Speaking as a product manager, it's kind of makes me want to tear my hair out. It's a way to introduce additional points of friction to using our products just as you, our customers, are starting to kick off a session using them. That's lousy. We don't want to do that to you. this is the operational problem, the bad user experience of having to log into multiple systems. But there's also an important security consideration to all this. And what I want to do here is point out sort of the difference between where we are now and where we want to be in terms of authentication model. But what I mean by that is largely right now, the way we handle authentication is AD over LDAPs or open LDAPs. It's, you know, that's sort of authentication model. Where we want to go, however, is instead moving to a model of identity federation. And that has a whole bunch of important implications that let me sort of talk everyone through. So when I talk about identity federation, by the way, just so everyone's speaking the same language as I am here, I'm talking about standards-based OIDC, OAuth2. It's the same experience that we experience as consumers on the web whenever we see a login with Facebook, login with Google, login with Apple. That's identity federation. And what's going on there is, you know, think about your last experience if you've ever actually used one of those mechanisms. I have. You would go to a website, and when you want to log in, instead of entering credentials into that website, the login with Google would take me to a Google box where I would enter my Google credentials. Google would validate them, assuming they're valid, send me back to that website that I started at with an identity token that's saying, yes, Joshua has been validated as this is who he is. This is a logged in user. And that website can say, great, Joshua, we know you're you. Here's your logged in dashboard. Importantly, in that scenario, that website never saw my credentials. Google was the only one who handled them. And that makes that website that much more secure because it doesn't have to touch credentials. It's that much less opportunity for identity-related security vulnerabilities to creep in. And so this move to identity federation has a bunch of important implications. And I'll be talking more about that over the course of the session. Anyway, so this basic problem statement, the fact that we don't have unified identity and the fact that it has both operational and security implications, that pretty directly leads to this mission of let's fix that. Let's develop that single unified identity and get every piece of our SDDC stack compatible with it so that we can provide one identity experience. That's our objective here. But let's break that down a little bit further and talk about what that actually means in terms of what we want to do and how we'll know whether we've succeeded or not. So, okay, first of all, single sign-on for our VMware products. I mentioned this at the beginning. This is a very easily identified marker, which is nice from a PM perspective. Have we succeeded or not? Have we been able to provide a true SSO experience across our SDDC stack? Can you log into vCenter and then switch over to a new browser tab and maybe access NSX Manager without having to log in again? But it's more than just that end user experience. It's also the management experience. We want to make sure that when an admin goes to configure the identity for any of the given SDDC products, that should be the same. It should work the same way. It should look the same, function the same, have the same options, as opposed to each individual product feeling like they've designed their own identity configuration experience without considering how other products might be doing it. So we want to bring all that together. Just a moment. We have a goal around supporting what our customers are asking us for, and specifically what we hear over and over again from our customer base is support for the identity providers that they're using with the rest of their IT organization. And really specifically, there's three that come up over and over again: Azure AD, Okta, and Ping. And they're all in the same class of identity provider, and all of them support OIDC, OAuth2 based federation. And our customers want to be able to integrate these VMware products into their broader organization that already uses these tools. And so that's an important goal for us, is we don't want to force our VMware products to be outliers in your organization. We want it to plug neatly into the identity infrastructure that you've already established. And the last point that I want to raise here in our list of goals that we keep in mind is around security. And I talked just a little bit a couple moments ago about security implications of moving to identity federation. And that's a really strong motivator. Now, the example that I was walking you through a couple moments ago, that was, consumer on the web kind of example. Let's map that experience onto what that would be in the SDDC stack. So what that might look like is, I'm a VI admin. I'm going to sit down at my workstation first thing in the morning, and I'm going to open my browser and hit my browser bookmark for my vCenter. Okay, great. Well, vCenter, this being the first time I've logged in today, it's going to need to validate me. But instead of me entering my credentials into a vCenter-based screen and then vCenter doing that processing, in this federated model, vCenter would redirect me in my browser out to my IDP, let's say Okta. I would see an Okta provided screen. That's where I would enter my corporate credentials. Okta would validate them, apply any MFA if needed or if configured, and assuming that the credentials are validated, redirect me back to vCenter with that identity token. And vCenter receives the token, says, great, Joshua, you are now logged in. Here's your dashboard. And again, in this scenario, remember, vCenter never saw the credentials, never touched them, thus making the entire system more secure and removing opportunities for vulnerabilities to creep in. But wait, it gets better, because now, continuing this thought experiment, I'm going to go back to my browser, hit Control-T, open a new tab, and now I'm going to hit my browser bookmark for, say, NSX Manager. Now, this time, experience is going to be similar to my vCenter login a couple moments ago. NSX is going to redirect me out to Okta because it's federated with that third-party identity provider. But this time, Okta will recognize that I already have been granted an access token from that login to vCenter a few minutes ago. That means Okta can say, oh, we've already validated Joshua, and it will automatically redirect me back to NSX Manager, and then I'm logged in there. And so the experience of that login is, from a user perspective, just a browser flash and then flash right back. And then I'm seeing my NSX Manager dashboard, and importantly, I never had to re-enter my credentials. And so, hallelujah, this is something we were not previously able to do. I've now been able to provide single sign-on or have a single sign-on experience between my vCenter and my NSX Manager. So that gives you an idea of where we want to go and how we want to support this. Now, I did briefly touch on MFA, and that is a really important piece of the puzzle for certain customers, for many customers, anyone with regulatory compliance, anyone who's particularly interested in securing their environment. Multi-factor authentication is considered to be best practices. Let me talk for a moment about vCenter and the other SDDC product support for multi-factor authentication, because let's be honest, it's uneven today if you look across our SDDC stack, right? You have some native MFA support in vCenter with the really big caveats that it's deprecated and can be removed at any time once we are ready to remove it. And also is really uneven relative to the rest of the SDDC products, because you can't rely on the other products having similar or even compatible MFA as with vCenter, not to mention, as I said, the vCenter native MFA functionality. We are waiting to be able to remove that. So today, again, our MFA story is a little shaky, I would say. that is a major driver toward this push to move to identity federation as the recommended best practice for how we'd like our customers to interact with our products through identity. The reason being, in a federated identity model, MFA becomes the responsibility of the identity provider with which the VMware products are federating. And so it no longer becomes an issue of, okay, well, we have to configure it this way in vCenter, and we have to configure it this way in NSX, we have to configure it this way in ARIA. Oh, wait, do they even have that option? I don't know. Forget all that. When you're using a third-party identity provider that you're federating with, you can configure multi-factor authentication at the identity provider. And that way, so again, going back to this thought experiment I've been using for what that experience is going to be like using the SDDC products with federated identity. Remember when I had my browser redirect me from a vCenter screen out to an Okta screen, and that Okta screen is where I would enter my corporate credentials to get access to my VMware products. It's at Okta where I, as an IT admin, would be able to configure my MFA. And the big advantage there is I only have to configure it in one place at the IDP. And that way, it then is applied to all of the products that are joining that federation. And so, again, going back to that thought experiment, so I'm hitting my vCenter dashboard, it's browser redirecting me out to Okta. Well, it's just on how I've configured Okta, whether or not that Okta screen is going to require me to use a second factor or not. From the VMware product perspective, that means we essentially get to be agnostic as to what was required by the IDP in order to generate that identity token. Was MFA required? Okay. Was it not required? Was it conditional? All that the VMware products need to care about is, did we get the identity token back from Okta or not? Did we? Great. Then we know that whatever conditions had been configured for Okta in order to generate that token have been satisfied. And so that makes a much better, easier, more seamless, more unified multi-factor authentication story across our SDDC stack. And that's something I think is a really big improvement that we're excited to bring to the table. Okay, so I think I've talked now for 10, 15 minutes about sort of the 20,000 foot view, the high level strategy of what we want to do and the why. I want to stop for a moment and invite any questions and check the Q&A before I go on to sort of the what and the when and the how.
Yeah, Joshua, we've got a few questions, and some of them, they came early, so you've already touched on some, but let's knock out the most recent one first, your topic. So what MFA third-party authenticators are supported? And I think you just identified that, but would you just recap?
Sure. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in that in a couple more slides when I talk about our rough roadmap of what we want to do. But okay, roughly speaking, what I can tell you is we have just released support for Okta, and our next priorities for identity providers we intend to support are Azure AD and Ping, and Workspace ONE Access, our own product.
Yeah. Okay, and so in terms of MFA, then it's going to be what the IDP will support. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. And then I think there was a question about Azure AD. I think you just identified that that's a understood to be a need that you'll address in the future, right?
Yes.
So there's a question about, let's see, what about SAML 2.0 IDPs, such as our on-prem and cloud-based Shibboleth servers?
So SAML, we've had an ongoing debate internally with our architects and engineering team about OIDC versus SAML. And in the end, we decided to implement our federation support with OIDC and not with SAML, mostly because we didn't see much of a need for SAML that wasn't addressed by OIDC. I'm not actually familiar with Shibboleth servers, so I'd be interested. Maybe I'll follow up afterwards to understand more about them to see if SAML is a hard requirement for those, or if they can work with with OAuth 2 OIDC.
Mm-hmm. Good. Will the web UIs be supported, including auxiliary applications, VME, ESXi, direct admin? Well, all the web UIs.
There's a couple different pieces to that. So let me tease that apart.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that I've been talking about here so far today, and that I will be talking about in this session, is about non-local regular corporate users. So, if you're a VI admin and you want to log into your VMware products, you shouldn't be using a local account. You should be using your corporate credentials, so that can be tracked and audited, and permissions can be properly applied, et cetera. That's really what this is about. This federated identity is enabling corporate users to be able to use those credentials with the VMware products. The other pieces that are mentioned there. So VAMI, that's separate. VAMI is not using corporate credential users. VAMI is using local users. That is something that we may invest in changing down the road, but that's not something we're working on right now. ESXi is also not in scope right now, though, again, we do have longer term plans to try to bring ESXi into this identity federation model so that we can essentially better lock down access to ESXi hosts. But again, VAMI access, ESXi access, those are going to be further out than anything what I'm talking about here today.
Okay. You knew someone was going to ask, is there a timeline for Azure AD?
I'm going to come back to timelines close to the end of the presentation. So
all right,
let me come back to that.
All right. Any neat tricks to make any of the third-party auth work for text authentication, i.e. for SSH shells, et cetera?
I'm not entirely sure about the use case that's being described here, but it seems like maybe that's something you might be able to use PowerShell for.
And then what about the authentication for PowerShell then?
We are working on building out the appropriate PowerShell hooks for all of the stuff I'm talking here about.
Okay, all right, good. Okay, so is there any caching or other fallback mechanism for when the connect to the auth server is not available?
I'm going to come back to that too when I talk a little bit more about the architecture and how we're looking at questions about availability. Perfect.
So again, if these questions that we're saying we're going to come to, if they don't get answered to your satisfaction, please, re-ask a specific part. And then someone asks, if we implement Okta, can we still have AD accounts that don't require MFA for service accounts, as an example?
I don't know the answer to that. My guess is that depends on how you configure your Okta.
I would think so too. I don't know for sure either, though.
Yeah, I would guess, and this is a guess not actually being familiar with this Okta functionality, that maybe you could configure MFA conditionally to not require it for specific accounts. But that's a guess on my part.
Yeah, but from the vCenter side, you just know you got the token.
Exactly.
Right? You don't really know what Okta did.
Right.
Okay. Okay, so there is clarification. I think the SSH question is when you need to get to direct command line of the vCenter appliance, is there a way to incorporate MFA for that access?
That's a good question.
Well, and again, so the questions about MFA, tell me if I'm wrong here, but if I'm understanding, we're getting out of the authentication business and to the federation business, and so it's whatever these sources do, right? That we're deferring to.
So I think the way I was thinking about that question is, when you want to SSH into a vCenter, how do you do that? Can we hook up that access into vCenter via command line to the IDP so that the IDP controls access to it? And the answer to that, I would have to go back and talk with my architects. My initial guess is I'm not sure how that would work because I mean, SSH is a well-defined protocol that we are actually trying to decrease use of because that's not, it's just one more avenue for potential misuse or bad actors to access a system. So from a protection point of view, this would be pretty important, but from an overall how people access this, then we would rather decrease use of SSH than add more controls onto SSH usage, if that makes sense.
Yep. Okay, good. I'll let you proceed. There's a couple of things out here, but I think they're related to what we're talking about. And so why don't you proceed and we'll swing around towards the end.
Sounds good. And there'll be more opportunities. We'll take questions over the course of the session. Okay. So I've given you here's what we're trying to accomplish and why, and what are the business drivers behind it. Let's transition to talking about what this actually looks like and how we're doing this, and a little bit of a hint on the when we're going to be able to deliver the different pieces. So we are in the process, actually, we have really effectively finished building the first version of a brand new identity service that's going to ship, that is shipping, in fact, with vCenter. And the role of this service is to enable federation. In fact, I think we ended up naming it something super functional like vSphere Identity Federation Service. And that Identity Federation Service, as its name implies, is meant to be that hub of identity across the SDDC. And in fact, let's switch to the diagram that maybe gives a little bit of a better impression of how the different pieces fit together. So what you see here in this diagram is at the center, you have your vCenter, and sitting on your vCenter is this Identity Federation Service that I was describing. That Identity Federation Service is what talks OIDC and OAuth2 to an IDP. So that's where you see these connections over here. And we have the different IDPs that we intend to support: Azure AD, Okta Ping, our own Workspace ONE Access, others potentially down the road, provisioning users and groups via SCIM 2.0 protocol so that you can get the users and groups from your IDP into vCenter and then apply permissions to groups, etc. And so that's how that piece of the puzzle works. But that federation service does more than just connect the IDP. It also serves as a broker for all of the other SDDC products to be able to hook up to that federation service so it can then broker the authentication requests out to the IDP and broker the responses back. And that's what enables these other products to join that same identity federation. And so our ultimate goal is to be able to have all of the SDDC products joining this single unified identity federation, all federated with your identity provider of choice, all then sharing single sign-on across them, all then sharing any MFA that was configured at the IDP level across all of them. And this is the architecture diagram of how we will finally achieve unified identity. Now, a couple other pieces I do want to explicitly call out here. So here on the right side of the screen, you'll notice that this does have AD listed here because realistically, while I did say earlier in this session that we want to encourage our customers to move to this new federated identity model, not everyone's going to be able to get there right away. And the long tail of our user base is the end of it may take a while. And so when I talk here about this new identity federation capability that we're introducing, this does not mean yanking out direct AD support, at least yet. This is all net new, all additive functionality that we're introducing into our products. I won't say that we will never remove direct AD connectivity. Again, go back to the security implications that I was referring to earlier of why identity federation is so much a better model. But again, we want to provide a smooth or as smooth as possible transition from direct AD to the federated model. And so this direct AD will still be around for at least a while until we are satisfied that we've gotten the bulk of our customer base onto the federated model and have provided the smooth off-ramp for anyone who's left. So I just wanted to point out the role that the on-premises pieces will still continue to play for at least the near future. Now, there was a question that was asked a little bit earlier in the Q&A about availability, and I do want to address that because that's really important. Something we absolutely do not want to do is turn this federation service into a single point of failure. And we don't want to put our users in a situation where, okay, you have your vCenter here and it's running this identity federation service, and all the other SDDC products are relying on that federation service. Well, okay, but then maybe your vCenter goes down. Well, we can't have that take down authentication services for all the other products, because just because your vCenter is down, you still might want to be able to log into your NSX manager or your ARIA automation dashboard or something. Those should all be working fine, and you should still be able to get into them, even if vCenter and its federation service go down. So with that requirement in mind, I want to sort of talk a little bit about how we're thinking about availability. And one of the key pieces that I'll call out here is this architecture diagram model that I'm showing you right now. This is, I guess I would describe it as our base case for architecture topologies. This is the simplest case. And the first mechanism by which we are releasing this identity federation service to our customers. So that's the first topology, the first architecture model in which you, our customers, will be able to take advantage of it. But it is not going to be the only topology model that we're going to support. We are currently in the midst of hashing out with our architecture team, our architects and key stakeholders from the other products about other deployment models for this federation service. So let me say a couple words about what this identity federation service is and a little bit of its history and context, just to give you a bit of a broader picture. So when you have the vRealize suite of products, soon to be renamed or maybe already renamed the ARIA suite, doesn't matter, same thing, you probably are aware that the VRS LCM, vRealize Suite Lifecycle Manager component, has as one of its roles to deploy and manage an LCM, an instance of Workspace ONE Access that is specifically meant to provide identity services to the vRealize products. And also NSX can work with it. I mentioned this before. That Workspace ONE Access, we want to kill it off. We want it to go away. There's a couple motivations here, all pushing in the same direction, but we hear a fair amount of complaints from customers about that particular product. We think that it adds additional complexity to SDDC deployments because you need to have this standalone deployment or even a cluster of deployments of Workspace ONE Access just to support identity. We want to pull that piece out. How can we do that? Well, it is going to be functionally replaced by this identity federation service. But I also want to say a little bit more about Workspace ONE Access, just to give a little bit broader picture, because Workspace ONE Access, it's a really interesting product. It today actually has two distinct use cases and code bases to work for those two use cases. And what those are, the first use case and code base is the classic end user computing use case, right? Workspace ONE Access as a product, its reason for existence is all around enabling end users to be able to get access to the resources that they're allowed to access. And so That Workspace ONE Access product gives you things like application catalogs, MFA, some other stuff. I'm not an expert on its full value prop, but it's this product that has its own benefits and values. But then there's this second use case and code base, which is for SDDC authentication. And so, like I was saying, some years ago, the Workspace ONE Access team actually forked that code base, and you can actually tell which is which by the numbering scheme. So if you ever see a Workspace ONE Access numbered in a year.month kind of a format, like a 22.09, I think was the release from last year, that's the Workspace ONE Access product that's meant for supporting end user computing, versus the Workspace ONE Access used for SDDC auth, the one that's deployed and managed by VRS LCM. That one is numbered in a 3.x format. So right now, 3.3, I think 337 or 338 is the most recent release of that one. And it's that 3.3 line that we intend to kill off. So there may be a 338 or something for security purposes, like security patch, but I can tell you that we intend there will never be a 3.4 or a 4.0. That 3.3x will be the end of that line. Now, how can we do this? Well, for one thing, as I said, it will be functionally replaced by this identity federation service, but there's a lot of moving parts here. For the 22.09 Workspace ONE Access, that's the code base. That's the one that is going to be the one that'll continue existing, where all development and further efforts will be focused on. But there's an interesting thing about that particular Workspace ONE Access product is that, historically speaking, architecturally, that product, I think the technical term is a big, hairy, ugly monolith. And, we're VMware, right? We like to preach the gospel of modern software development and microservices and containers and all that good stuff. And so the Workspace ONE team has been able to take this opportunity for all these moving parts transition I've been describing to refactor Workspace ONE Access and break it down into microservices that can be containerized. And just that opens up so many more options for that product. And so believe me, they're really excited about paying off that technical debt and being able to unlock that new capabilities for this end user computing product. But also, that refactoring of the product is what allows us to create the Identity Federation Service. Because what is the Identity Federation Service? It is literally a subset of those microservices from the newly refactored Workspace ONE Access, put into a container, and then that container put onto VCSA, and boom, that's the Identity Federation Service. And so this really is providing great value in a bunch of different parts of our product organization. So it's like I said, a lot of moving parts. But one of the other key implications here, and so now I'm going to tie this story back into the high availability question that I started off talking about. The Identity Federation Service is just a container. And so we're looking at ways to be able to run that container in other places where you can have a container runtime other than vCenter. And so when I talk about how we're planning to provide a highly available identity solution here, that's what that's going to look like once we finish hashing out the details, is what other deployment topologies for this federation service container will end up supporting for the various requirements of the different products. And so I don't have a nifty diagram to illustrate that yet, because as I said, we're still hashing out some of the final details, but this diagram at least gives you a sense of how all the pieces fit together and the initial deployment model. And then you can, use your imagination and imagine this federation service living over here maybe, and living over here, and then using container orchestration to maintain high availability, et cetera. Lots of options there. So I hope that gives you a sense of how we're thinking about making sure we don't introduce a single point of failure. Let me stop here. Any more questions on what this looks like architecturally and how the pieces fit together that I've been describing?
Yeah, let me knock out a couple here. I think this is an easy one. Will this be added to vSphere 7 in a future release? Or will version 8 be
no.
required?
Version 8 will be required. As you might imagine, this is a pretty significant architectural change under the hood. And so that's not something that we have an option to backport.
Okay. And I think you just confirmed this, but so is it on the roadmap for these federation services to replace the current federation services on the VMware cloud apps like ARIA Cloud Operations, Automation, Skyline, et cetera?
So the cloud federation services, interestingly enough, are already using this model because they are using what is under the hood a Workspace ONE access in the cloud. And so that's one of the other drivers to help push us in this direction, is because the cloud, ARIA automation, et cetera, they're already using this federation model. And so once we finish rolling this out and get all the pieces hooked up properly, that will also enable hybrid identity, the ability to log in once and have that identity shared between cloud services and on-prem services. You know, this fits very well in alignment with VMware and our overall message about enabling cloud smart, cloud anywhere, hybrid cloud. We don't want you to have to think too much about, am I going into a cloud service? Am I going to on-prem service? What are my credentials? Do I need different ones? No. We want that to all be treated as one unified solution that you don't have to think about which piece is coming from where.
Good. What about enhanced linked mode? What's the impact there?
Enhanced link mode is an ongoing work that we are actually hip deep in the middle of right now, which is to provide the right behavior in an ELM configuration. What we're, gosh, I don't want to say something incorrect about this because we're hashing this out right now. So I will say that it is a configuration that we are very much taking into account and want to make sure the behavior works properly. And we're going back and forth between, should we have a model in which each node in the ELM ring has one of these federation services and it's enabled, or do we have just one in the ELM ring, and in which case, which one? And if that one dies, then we fire up another one. You know, you can imagine we're thinking hard about how to address these questions right now. And so even though I don't have an answer for you today, we will have an answer. Okay,
got it. You were brave for coming on this webinar in general. With we're early on in some of this, so thanks for sharing what you can here.
Sure.
Okay, I heard a lot about local HA, but didn't quite catch the answer here. If what fallbacks are there for when the third-party auth is not accessible?
So when the third-party when third-party auth is inaccessible because you can't get to the third party, or your connection to Okta or Azure AD is gone, then your fallback is local accounts. Local accounts, as I mentioned, are not included in this. Those are staying the same. Those will still be there. But we really want to emphasize that local accounts are meant for break glass scenarios, like when your connectivity to your IDP is broken. That shouldn't be the regular process by which anyone is accessing your vCenter or your other VMware applications, but it is the fallback mechanism for when you can't get to the IDP.
Okay. Can we have multiple authentication sources?
Right now, we are not planning on allowing that, but I would be interested to learn more about the use case for why that would be required.
So Brian, if you want to filter that through your TAM to Joshua, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, in fact, let's take that as an action item for follow-up later. Please connect with your TAM about that and have the TAM connect with me, and then I can make sure that we understand the requirements, and if there's a need there, then how we can work that into our roadmap.
Okay, so we added a comment about service accounts was kind of the follow-up, I think, example that may fit that, but it sounds like maybe a direct conversation might be beneficial to both of you.
I think so.
Okay. Will certificate authentication be supported out of the box? Like for CAC?
So for CAC, like I said, we want to get out of the CAC business. And we want to put responsibility for CAC onto the IDP. Certificate-based auth, I would imagine, is something that you could configure at the IDP. I mean, for instance, we as internal VMware employees have a federated login model for how we access our internal corporate applications here. And the IDP with which our internal corporate applications are federating happens to be Workspace ONE Access, the 22.09, the end user computing model, which is listed on here because it can act as a full-fledged IDP. And again, I'm glad I differentiated between the Workspace ONE Access 3.3 for SDDC use, which is the one that's going away, versus Workspace ONE Access 22.09, which is the one that's not going away, has more features, has been refactored, and act as an IDP, and is one of the IDPs that we're going to support federating with from vCenter. Anyway, the point I was attempting to make here was Workspace ONE Access, as we use it internally, we have that same experience logging into an internal application like, say, Slack. And so Slack redirects us to Workspace ONE Access. That's where we enter our VMware corporate credentials, redirects us back there. The key point here is Workspace ONE Access can be configured to accept certificate-based auth. And when we, again, as internal VMware employees, want to access an application like Slack, if we have the appropriate certs, if I have a cert on my laptop, then I don't even need to enter credentials. Then Workspace ONE Access can use that cert to validate my identity and grant me that token so that I could get into my Slack. And so all that is to say, I think the cert-based auth is something that you would enable at the IDP. Certainly that's how you would handle CAC support, not at the VMware product level anymore.
Okay, and so along the way, we have gotten a couple requests for the definition of some of the acronyms. And so
Sure.
I think we've knocked out SDDC earlier on. We're getting
software-defined data center.
Right, and then CAC?
CAC, I actually don't remember what it stands for,
but
Is it
Common Access Card?
Yeah, yes, thank you, yes.
Okay.
I know it as CAC, the most common multi-factor authentication method used by a lot of federal government type customers. It's a common multi-factor or two-factor authentication method relying on smart cards. And so that CAC support is what I was referring to earlier, that there does exist in vCenter today, but is deprecated and is on the path to being removed from the product entirely, which is why we want to encourage our customers to shift how they think about CAC as not being a vCenter thing, rather being an IDP thing.
And that was the last one, IDP.
Identity provider.
Okay. And so the one that's supported today or with U1 is Okta.
Yes.
Right? So that would be an example of an IDP.
Yes. And all of these that you see here in this column, these are all identity providers, IDPs, Azure AD, Okta, Ping, Workspace ONE Access. ADFS is an identity provider. Now, just to get into sort of the weeds of semantics, just because we've gone there, I do want to draw a distinction between an identity provider, IDP, versus an identity source. So Active Directory, AD on-prem, this triangle here, that's an identity source, versus an identity provider, which is something that you can federate with. And so when you're talking about AD over LDAPs, that's using AD as an identity source. When you're talking about federated model, then you're talking about federating with an identity provider. And so that's that IDP here, that these are the IDPs we support, ADFS, another IDP we've already supported, et cetera. So hopefully that clarifies some terminology there.
That's good. Thanks. Will this be able to utilize some sort of connector, in quotes, server that will have access to the internet to do the auth? We have a large number of vCenters plus VRA servers. Do not want to allow them out to the internet.
So I would ask the question of what identity provider or identity source do you want to use? So if you want to use an internet-based IDP like Azure AD or Okta or Ping, then I think the proper recommendation would be to follow one of those more complex deployment models that I was referring to that I don't have a diagram here for yet, but I think that's effectively the connector that you're asking about, which you would be able to have an identity federation service running in its container somewhere other than vCenter, maybe running in a DMZ, so that that could be your connectivity, that could be your connector out to the internet-based IDP, while leaving all of your sensitive installations inside the firewall without internet access. So stay tuned again for more guidance on those more complex deployment models that I said will be coming soon.
Yep, perfect. All right, I think we're good to move on for now.
Okay, great. So that then gives me a great segue to talk about what we're supporting and giving a little bit of hint about when. Now, again, I want to be very careful here because dates and features and versions are all subject to change. I'm going to emphasize that again. But first of all, let me talk about what we've released so far. I don't have to worry about that. That's already out in public, which is to say that just about, what was it, 2-3 weeks ago now, we GA'd vSphere 8 Update 1. And that was a huge cause for celebration on my team and the folks that I work with, because that vCenter 8U1 carried with it the very first identity federation service. And in that identity federation service, we've added 2 new pieces of functionality that haven't been there before. First of all, federation with Okta. And so with VC 8U1, you can now federate with Okta for the first time ever. You couldn't do that before. And the second new piece of functionality that we introduced in 8U1 was federation between vCenter and NSX. So again, you couldn't do this before, but now starting with VC 8U1 and NSX 4.1, you can now have them join the same identity federation and thus get SSO between them. Very exciting. So this is now out in public, generally available. You can download it and use it right now. But as you can imagine, this is only the first steps into a longer journey to realize our ultimate rainbows and unicorns type of vision here. And the remaining steps that we need to take in order to realize that full vision really break down, I want to say, into 2 categories, 2 main categories: adding support for additional IDPs and adding support for additional VMware products to join the federation. So let me talk about each of those 2 axes. First of all, additional IDP support. We are currently working on Azure AD. So the prioritization of the next identity providers that we intend to support in this model is next Azure AD, followed by Workspace ONE Access, followed by Ping. The next release of vSphere, and specifically vCenter, will be 8 Update 2, and I would expect to see some new IDPs supported in that 8 Update 2 world. I don't want to say anything further about how many or which ones, other than to say I've told you the prioritization sequence that we're doing them in, and that we are working on them now. And so we're going to, assuming all goes to plan, support some number of new IDPs in 8 Update 2. Anything we don't get to in 8 Update 2, I intend to have us support in 8 Update 3. So by the time we've reached the end of the 8.x line, I certainly hope that we would have support for all of these identity providers. Again, subject to change, but that's our plan. On the other axis, the axis of adding support for additional VMware products, so what we have GA today, I mentioned, has vCenter and NSX support. The next priorities are to bring VCF into the picture. And VCF is a little bit of a more complicated beast because it actually has two parts to when we talk about it's supporting this new identity model. The first part is, excuse me.
VCF is VMware Cloud Foundation.
Yes, thank you. VMware Cloud Foundation. The first part of that is having Cloud Foundation itself support using the Federation service for its identity. So the actual component of Cloud Foundation that you log into is called SDDC Manager. We want to have SDDC Manager able to join the Federation. But the other piece of full Cloud Foundation support for this model is, well, Cloud Foundation is effectively an automation framework. And so the other piece of it is having Cloud Foundation have the ability to configure the identity of all of the other pieces to join the Federation. So for those not familiar with Cloud Foundation, it's really an SDDC in a box that comes with vCenter, comes with NSX, comes with vRealize Lifecycle Manager, comes with the SDDC Manager component that I was referring to that handles LCM of all the other pieces. And so this Cloud Foundation capability for supporting Identity Federation means not just supporting it itself, but configuring all of its pieces to support it as well. So that's next on the list for products we want to bring into this Identity Federation. Then after that comes the vRealize or ARIA products. Those are going to be a little bit more complicated to bring into this model, mostly because they have to make that transition from the Workspace ONE Access 3.3 model to this new Identity Federation model. And so we need to make sure that there's a really smooth off-ramp from the current model to the future model. And that has a lot of moving parts to it, but it's going to happen. It's just going to take a little bit longer. And then beyond that, then you start getting into, so the ones that I mentioned, vCenter, NSX, Cloud Foundation, vRealize / ARIA, those are what I think of as core SDDC products. And those are the key components of scope for our initial work here. Looking out a little bit further out in the future, that's where we get into things like, how can we bring this to ESXi servers? How can we bring this to TCA, which is our telco product? How can we bring in other pieces that make sense from a use case perspective? Because, I mean, we want to make sure what we're doing is of value. If there's products that make sense conceptually to have unified identity, then we want to make sure we can deliver that. So that hopefully gives you a little bit of sense of where we are today, what we have just recently released, this very first GA step, very, very exciting, and the key priorities of our roadmap going forward through the next couple of releases. So
Joshua, one other question would be in a different direction that you didn't go, the VMware Cloud and AWS solution.
Yep.
Is that out in some of those other ancillary features or other products you mentioned?
So
in terms of unifying?
The unified identity across the VMC services is something that we are working on now, because as I mentioned, one of our objectives here is to enable hybrid identity. And so, yeah, I didn't mention that just now in the pieces that we're intending to, the additional VMware products we're intending to add support for, but one of them, look right here in the top left corner of my slide, is CSP, which is our cloud services portal, which is what provides identity services to VMC. And so once we bring this CSP into the picture as well, which shouldn't be overly complicated because I mentioned before, it's using the same Workspace ONE Access technology under the hood. that will enable hybrid identity across the VMC pieces powered by CSP identity and the on-prem pieces powered by this identity federation service.
Got it. All right. There's no other active questions.
Okay. Well, I guess we hit the hour mark, so good timing there.
Yeah, perfect.
So I guess let me wrap up briefly by thanking everybody for attending and for asking good questions. And if any other questions come up or other feedback, as Andy was mentioning earlier, please don't hesitate to reach out to your TAM who can connect with me, and we can have those discussions or get the answers that you're looking for.
Perfect. Thank you. So really interesting and timely information. Thanks so much for coming on today, Joshua, and sharing what has been done, some of the thinking behind it, and it's been really useful. And to all the participants, thank you for joining in. And as we mentioned at the beginning, this was recorded. Your TAM can make that recording link available to you in the next couple of days. And do join us in June for the NSX Advanced Load Balancer session. It's going to be another good session. And again, watch for the registration links from your TAM for that. All right. And with that, we'll wrap up. Thanks so much.
Bye.